When it comes to systems, you want something that will start showing results fast. You're looking for a tool that can enable your 3PL or warehouse to get to the next level. So why wait? That's why Carton Cloud provides supported, fast onboarding that can have your WMS up and running in hours, not months. Jump into Carton Cloud's easy-to-use workflows for all of your services, including cross-docking, serialized inventory tracking, e-commerce order fulfillment, and more. This software is built by logistics people for logistics people, and those logistics people are standing by to help train you and support you so that you can be successful with your customer. With 24/7 real-time reporting and free online training, you need to check out Carton Cloud for your operation. Take the next step in your operation by heading to cartoncloud.com/free-demo or click the link in the show notes.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And on today's episode, I am going to be joined by Casey Winans, who is the founder and CEO at Fullstride and a WMS lover. He's a WMS guy on LinkedIn, if you've ever seen him around there. So we're going to talk about today, of course, WMS. We're going to dive into some different aspects of that. We're going to talk about Casey's background, and we're going to talk about his company, Fullstride, as well, and what they're looking to do. So, Casey, welcome to the show. How are you?
Hey, thanks for having me.
Definitely happy to get you on. I think it's about time. I've been seeing you around the LinkedIn streets for a little while, so definitely good to get you on and kind of dive into this topic and really get your views on WMS, since that's your big focus I see out there. So why don't you kind of first give us a little brief overview of your background and how you kind of came to found this company that you have now called Fullstride?
Sure. Yeah. I've been around this space for over 20 years. I started out not knowing I was in supply chain. I came out, I didn't quite have a computer science major. The school I was going to, they were missing a class. So I came out with what you would call management information systems.
Okay.
So more on the business side, but very heavy in engineering, computer programming. So I did that right out of school working for GE. Then I moved on to a startup that spun out of GE doing reverse auction procurement software, which was kind of cool. I got into some of like the early on like product ownership roles for a very, very small team. And then I moved on to, I guess, maybe like a 60 to 70 million remanufacturer. I guess maybe that's the category they were in. And that's where I got into building systems. And I didn't necessarily realize that was not what you did. Most people buy packaged software. So I did that for a few years. I learned a whole lot. And when I moved my family from Pennsylvania to North Carolina to take a job at Red Prairie, which is now Blue Yonder, that's when I discovered this concept of supply chain that I was in. And it all of a sudden everything clicked. I'm like, oh, this makes so much sense. Somehow or another, I wasn't well versed in that term, nor logistics. But once I got there, a lot of the knowledge and the skills I had picked up beforehand became very valuable. Just to give you an example, I built a parcel manifesting system, very deeply ingrained with UPS, and I learned a whole lot about the nitty gritty behind the scenes that you typically wouldn't see or be privy to when you're just using some software. So that helped me a lot, advise clients, and that was the role I took at Red Prairie, was the consulting side. So I would get in and do some configuration and maybe some enhancements, but most of the time I was with the business, learning that aspect of it, translating what they needed into something that the software would do. I did that for a few years, and then I followed a mentor to a 3PL that was based out of Canada. And I was there for about a year and a half, and I got to take what I learned, but I guess maybe upgrade it to an extent, because I was no longer working for the vendor. So when there were design decisions or design flaws that came up, I didn't have to necessarily take it on the chin anymore and, eat crow. I could actually talk about it and have an honest conversation and figure out, this is how we typically approach, said situation and move on. And it was very rewarding. I got great feedback. And about a year and a half into that, Red Prairie and JDA merged, or one bought the other, however you wanted semantics aside. And the mantra coming out of that was, we don't do customizations. So at that point, this was, what was it? Must have been beginning of 2013. And there was all these big customers that had projects in flight, spending 7 figures. And the question at that moment was, what do you mean you don't do customizations? I have a project that's in flight. So what happened effectively was there was this perfect moment where people could stand up businesses and get in there. So me and 2 partners that I worked with before, we stood up a company, and we basically met the needs of the market there. And we grew that. Well, I grew that with them for about 5 years or so. We went to just over 10 million in revenue, about 60 people. And we helped the big companies out there implement Blue Yonder, or JDA at the time, whatever it was called.
Okay.
And then after that, I split ways with my 2 partners. We had a different vision for the future. They wanted to pursue software. I wanted to pursue more of managed services in there. And it's, 2 against 1 effectively, right? 3's a crowd. So I parted ways. I had a non-compete for a couple of years. So I bounced around helping folks do business consulting and kind of do the pricing and strategy piece around it so they could get past billable hours. That was one part of what I was working on. And then COVID hit. So that was a fun year or so, or most of a year, where there wasn't a whole lot going on, just surviving effectively. Everyone was kind of in transition. And coming out of that, I took a role for about 1.5 years working for a company called Open Sky Group. It was actually an ex-competitor of mine. Met the CEO at some event. We hit it off, and he wanted to transition to a solutions company. So we spent 1.5 years standing up advisory, answering those early stage questions. And it was very rewarding. He retired, I moved on, and I started Fullstride. And effectively, it was the embodiment of everything I've learned over the last 20 years baked into this company here. I want to do it differently. I want to focus on a smaller part of the market. And that's the mantra there. I don't know how much you want me to get into that now, or we'll come back to it. But
yeah. Let's come back to it, because I want to dig in there a little bit to your background and stuff. I mean, it's very interesting, and I love the kind of culmination of everything coming together, and I guess that doing supply chain logistics related stuff and not even knowing it at the time, right? No. So I mean, I'm curious, as you started to develop these types of things, looking at management information systems, obviously there's multiple different types out there that can be utilized through a business perspective, but you seem to kind of gravitated towards the warehouse management systems, or WMS. I'm curious, where does kind of that, because I will say that, based on, what I see you put out as content on LinkedIn and things like that, I mean, there's certainly a passion around the WMS side of things and a focus on that. So I'm curious why, that kind of attracted you to that type of software, and, what do you like about being involved with different WMS solutions, or just talking WMS in general? I'm
a creative guy. And when I gravitated towards software engineering, computer science, it was my outlet. It was something I discovered. I had never been around computers until college. This was still back like before people had cell phones, and so that was the early piece of it. And it just happened to be that I gravitated towards supply chain. It was serendipitous, really. GE was the huge employer where I grew up, so I got into some of the pieces there, and then I moved on to the next one. And there must have been some knowledge that I had that I didn't necessarily appreciate at that point that kind of led me that way. The reason I really love WMS is because when you get into a warehouse operation, there are a lot of moving parts, a lot of surface area. And if you approach it well, you can make something very productive, and you can do it very efficiently. Few people making them very, very productive that way. Or if you don't go into it right, and you can basically stop the business. So there's some risk involved. And it's a challenge. That right there is balancing those, making sure you can push the business forward. And I would have to say there was a point in time where I didn't feel like I loved WMS. And it was probably just after I parted ways with McGregor Partners, my first business. in that period of time in between where I'm like, I want something different. And during that reflection, I realized it wasn't the space itself. It was probably the size of businesses I was working with and the expectations of working with one vendor. And I felt kind of boxed in. I mean, it's looking back at my career, I was never a great employee. And I think it was because I like to wear a lot of hats. I don't like being boxed in. I have ideas. And when you're working for a big company, which is what I had done for a big chunk of my career, is I had a specific role. So business ownership was something that really, really made a lot of sense for me. And I love the challenge of putting in warehouse management systems and just working with a whole bunch of different people, right? They'll have value. They have insights to bring, and surfacing that is fun for me. So during that period of reflection, I realized the ones that I loved to work with were the ones that were just up and coming, right? They're getting their first systems, or they're early on in that growth. So there's like a growth stage going on versus being very mature, and they're just replacing one with another, and you're doing very tactical work. I like to have influence over design and the approach, and then sharing guidance and my recommendations that way. So coming back around, it was, how do I do that? And that's working with the smaller businesses and looking at some different WMSs out there that might not be, the top, the big three or big four, however you want to put it together that way. And that's kind of where I'm at today. I love that space.
Yeah. I think that's a great thing. And I can definitely relate to what you're saying. For people out there, believe it or not, I didn't always love warehouses. It took a little time in my career to really embrace them. And that's kind of how the whole podcast came together in itself. But yeah, I mean, I think it's great too. And I love to hear that, you didn't want to be kind of stuck in that box, and you're broken out of that box at this point, right? With Fullstride, definitely fully. And, you're focusing on, I mean, I guess tell us a little bit, Fullstride, like what's your actual kind of focus and target with Fullstride?
Sure. Yeah. I guess to sum it up very succinctly, and then I'll kind of expand on it, is we help mid-sized businesses pursue their first WMS. And where we really focus there is the stuff that happens before you talk to a vendor.
Yeah.
So it's getting your house in order, and everyone kind of comes to the table. The basic assumption is, our processes are well defined. We're all on the same page. But when you start asking questions, it quickly becomes quite different when you get multiple answers to a question you thought would have one and it'd be simple.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of preparation that goes on before you look at a particular vendor or a set of vendors. So we focus there, and what we call that is clarity first, right? We get in there, we talk to leadership and the front lines, and we really kind of unpack what's going on and try to connect the dots between the two. You have business goals from leadership, and then you have frontline folks that are doing all the things that really are important or impactful for the customers at that last touch point. So there's this potential for a disconnect. And when you get them all talking and sharing that, then you can get the people that are doing the work in the warehouse. They understand how their contribution matters, especially when there's going to be a change. They understand how they can tie that back together, and it goes so much smoother versus the change that feels like it's pushed.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a silo. So we do a lot of that. It doesn't always mean that we're going to do a system right off the bat. It means that there's probably a lot of homework, and there usually is.
Yeah.
For a lot of companies, it's actually not only getting the processes well defined and getting all the different adjacent teams outside the four walls talking and working through all those points of conflict that you see. You see a lot of finger pointing, no matter the size of the business. But getting them to talk to figure out, can we get some guardrails in there? I use the example a lot with sales. So they're talking to customers, maybe even customer service talking to customers, and you get a seemingly small change late in the game.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of ramifications for the folks on the floor. And of course, it's us versus them at that point. But if you can get them talking and sharing where those points of contention are, you can maybe work backwards and find out, is there a cutoff time that works for everybody? And you can figure those out. And if they're empowered with that, they can talk to the customer and say, hey, we can make that change by a certain part of the day. If not, it's going to be next day. And there you go. You give people choices that way, explicit choices. And there's a lot of that can go on.
Yeah. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because it's, it is at the end of the day. I mean, going back to where you said the change there, make the change smoother. I mean, a big part of putting in any system or any type of, solution just in general is the change aspect. And I love that you said getting them to understand the why and their impact on that change as well is incredibly important to get that going and through that whole change management process. And I've certainly myself, as a previous warehouse manager, operations manager, have been at odds with a salesperson or two in my day when they're telling the customer something that operationally is not something that we've kind of set up ourselves up for, or been able to do, and then we have to kind of move a bunch of things around to make those things happen. But I think having those guardrails, like you said, is really important to do, and being able to build that foundation, I think is a great thing. So very interesting focus for Fullstride, and I think it's really good that you're doing that. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the landscape of WMS providers right now, because I think obviously there's the big players that have been around. You worked for one for a while, and the other ones out there that have been omnipresent, I guess, in the space for a long time. But there's a lot of startup WMSs that are coming out too, that are focused on these smaller, medium-sized businesses, or just taking a different approach altogether. So I'm curious your thoughts, like as you look at the current landscape of WMS providers. I mean, how would you define the landscape right now? And there's so many options, I think.
Right. Yeah. There are a ton of options out there. And I mean, the unfortunate, I guess, way things typically work is you get a subset that get a lot of limelight. The analysts out there, that they highlight certain ones for a bunch of different reasons. I could go in and tear that down for a bit and get very opinionated, but
Yeah.
Effectively they have a leg up where the smaller ones don't necessarily, but they all come with, I wouldn't say baggage, but just very big expectations that are not always called out. It's like buying a very fancy car and you have all the maintenance that comes with it. So it could potentially be too much for you long term when you factor in all the other investments you have to do versus something a little more practical to start with, especially if you can acknowledge that most of the work, and then this is kind of where I guess I talk to folks and I kind of unpack this, is you're buying technology, but this isn't a technology project, not in the grand scheme of things. I mean, there's a component for sure, but it comes after you get the people and the processes all ironed out, because if you don't have them, that technology is not going to save you no matter what.
Yeah.
Going back, I'm a fan of when I'm looking at where this is going right now. You have the established players, and there's a heavy emphasis on professional services. That's just been the model, and I think it came out of the fact that when it was on-premise software and there before the internet, you had armies of people to come out and do this work at some location, and it was complicated and very complex, especially when you get into the bigger vendors that almost are like a Swiss Army knife, right? They do so many things. They cater to so many industries. And no matter what you do there, you can't hide all that complexity. So you need a lot of people to kind of get that going. And they try to simplify it. But I would have to say it's easier to go up market than it is to go back down market.
Yeah. Because
you've made some design choices there. And then the money is another issue there. You have expectations on what you're making per contract. But that's one thing I like about the smaller vendors that are coming up now. And I think that's what you asked me potentially, but they're looking at it differently, and they're coming from the standpoint. I mean, they might do some on-premise, but more or less it's very much focused on the SaaS model where it's deployed in the cloud. It's less about version. It's more about capabilities, and they can continuously improve. So when you do that, and we've seen it in other industries, there's a lot more focus on sharing documentation, onboarding programs, so you can get to the point where the less complex businesses out there, those customers, they can do a whole lot more themselves, a little more self-serve. And I think that model is what's going to effectively, maybe not completely eat the lunch of the bigger ones, but it's definitely going to be influencing how they evolve, because it's easy to move up market from there, right? It's working for small businesses. You keep evolving that process there. It can work for bigger and bigger companies over time. And then there's still that potential for professional services, but it's going to be more of like what I'm doing, where we're more like the independent client advocate of making sure the business can talk to the vendor and translate those requirements. That part is pretty universal. So,
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see because even some of the bigger players like we were talking about. I mean, I know like Manhattan, for example. They've also tried to move to a cloud version too as well, and it seems like that's more flexible and there's more like you said, opportunity to do some self-service there and understand the capabilities of what's happening. And I think the days of I remember when I first started my career, we were a couple months into my first role, we were going through a WMS upgrade, and I think it took something like 8 or 9 months or something, right, to do that. And I think those days are kind of gone with these SaaS models and the cloud and all those different things. So I think for small and medium-sized businesses especially, I mean, that's a big win, right? Because it's a lot less expensive, like you mentioned. There's a lot more flexibility. There's different optionality to be able to kind of scale and grow. And I think there's a lot of different options out there to find the right fit for what you're doing. But I guess my question to you, I mean, for people that are in that position, and they're looking for a WMS, I mean, with the amount of kind of newer, I mean, we could call them startup WMSs in a sense. I mean, should they be cautious when considering those? I mean, what should they be looking out for? Or do you think that it's okay to, go after something new and a newer type solution?
We'll be back after a quick break.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. Do you want more warehouse content delivered to your inbox? Sign up for our new email series called Warehouse Wisdom Wednesday to get an educational series of emails on warehouse basics delivered directly to you every Wednesday morning. Find the sign up link in the show notes.
sure. Well, I mean, I guess my blanket response is, yeah, there's risk involved there. You need to understand how capitalized they are, right? There's ones that are venture backed, and there's some out there that are bootstrapping based on, realistically pleasing customers and growing based on revenue. So there's an aspect there. Another one that probably doesn't get as much attention as it should is the ability to execute. And that's not necessarily just focused on the startups. I mean, there are some that are well established that don't necessarily have well-oiled game plans and processes in place too. So you get in and you buy something and it's pushing them forward. So that's another piece there, is like, how well do you feel that you set up for success? How plugged in and how I guess energetic are they? I've bumped into several where they're doing things that won't scale long term, but they're doing it for the right reasons. They want to improve the product. They want to make sure, and they're investing in the onboarding piece of it too. So it goes smoother the more customers they get on there in their particular niches. Those are all things that I would say watch out for, and they de-risk effectively. I mean, more or less, do they feel like they're going to be around? Are you hearing good things? And that's almost like a chicken and egg kind of problem there too, right? Because some folks need to bet on these ones early on to be able to get some of those accolades so others will follow suit. So, yeah, but I mean, I try to make sure I'm always including those upstarts too, and talking to the founders to figure out what the vision is. Yeah. What's your mindset, where you came from, how are you doing things different? Because that's a big part of it too. You don't want to necessarily go out and build yet another WMS because there's a bunch out there. Yeah. And you bring some secret sauce to it that makes sense for the market in your particular niche that you're in. And that's probably another piece there I'd be looking at, is when you're looking at a startup, are they focusing on something specific, or are they trying to boil the ocean? And that's when they're trying to do too much, it makes it very hard for them to really kind of stand out and last long that way. They need to really have some secret sauce and to make it worth for you, especially if you're going to take the risk of adopting them. Yeah. Can they do something that you can't find anywhere else? That's a big one.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think, understanding the vision too is such a key there. Like you said, I think it's interesting to, the position, if you're one of those early adopters of like a new WMS, for example. I think it can be maybe advantageous to you as well, because, if they're still, kind of building, and, they have this vision of other, features they want to add and all these things. I mean, if you're an early customer, you kind of, in a sense, can help guide that a little bit to your own advantage, right? So you can kind of say like, oh, well, this works for me, this doesn't work for me, or we should change it this way, and things like that. And I think, and I've seen some of that certainly happening like in the market, and I think there's an advantage there too on that side. But I think it makes sense what you're saying, like, make sure that is this going to fit within the use case that you have with your business, and then is it also going to over time continue to evolve the way you want it to evolve, or that makes sense to you. So I think it's important to have those conversations with the founders, like you said. So very, very interesting there. And I think, in addition to, seeing a lot of different approaches to WMS, and, lots of different options coming in the market, there's also kind of a lot of talk, especially with automation and robotics coming into the operations more frequently. And I think kind of that barrier to entry is getting lower and lower from like a cost perspective. So I think we're going to see, more penetration on the small and medium-sized businesses as well. When we look at that, we have WMS, WCS, WES, all these acronyms, right, that we love in supply chain. But, as you start to look at that and you start to consider some of those things in your operational roadmap, I mean, how important is kind of the intersection of all of those? Because I know some WMSs now, like, they're having warehouse execution systems kind of built in with them as well. But where does kind of that intersection happen, and how important is that into consideration of selecting the right WMS?
I'd have to say, since I'm working with folks that are pursuing their first, it's not as much of a consideration at that point in time.
Okay.
But what I would like to say is that I think we interacted this morning actually on a post about AutoStore scaling down some of their automation. The PO. Like, that concept there gets me excited, because it's something that you can bring in earlier than you traditionally could before. They were very capital intensive. And if you can bring that in, that accelerates the importance of some type of mechanism, WCS, WES, inside of the warehouse management system to interface with those and make good use of it. So I think that's probably a trend. And I'm just kind of going off script here to an extent, right? I'm just shooting from the hip. I see that being more and more important, right? And when we used to see the WES, WCS, and they were separate because they were more or less attacking the top part of the market, right? They were like these big, everything was expensive at that point. So now you're kind of seeing them come down market, and it's more important to have a hybrid solution. And we're seeing patterns of integration and things like that probably didn't exist 20 years ago. So I could see that being very beneficial, especially this morning I geeked out on that post. I'm like, that seems to be something that could be very useful for a prospect that I'm talking to right now. Moving from one system to another for an external reason, but there's always cost pressure, and that's we're looking for ways to recoup margin and grow that. And there you go. There's something there that potentially could be a solution that helps on the smaller end of the business. And you deploy a couple of those, and you start to grow very economically. And in theory, right? This is all unproven at the moment, but that's where my brain goes. I get excited about the patterns that I'm seeing here, and like, does this work? Does it really pay out? I think it will. Enough time.
Yeah, interesting. And Pio, friend of the podcast, so shout out to Pio. But yeah, I mean, I think their solution is certainly interesting, and it's certainly helping to, like I said before, kind of just lower that barrier to entry to automation and being able to utilize something like that. So I think it'd be interesting to see. And I think, it's seeing, kind of these things just get kind of built in together as like, packages kind of coming to market. And I think that's where it's going to make the most sense for those small to medium sized businesses to be able to leverage some of these types of technologies and have them work. Because I think that's one thing too, like the difference between some of the bigger players, like you were talking about, early on, where things were costing a lot of money. Well, the bigger players, like, they got some money to play with, right? Whereas you get down to like a medium-sized business, especially a small business, they don't really have extra cash to play with and experiment and things. If they're going to invest in something, like, it's got to work, right? Because it's going to take their business to the next level, like to maybe then, get to a point where maybe they can play around. But, I think that's important. So I think it'd be interesting to see kind of how that evolves a little bit, and those more of those kind of built-in packages and stuff come together. So I'm curious too, kind of before we wrap up here, we had another little, talking about interactions. I know we mentioned LinkedIn here a couple of times, but this morning as well, there was a post where we both kind of commented on asking about, whether if you're going to kind of go with off-the-shelf software versus making something custom in-house. And you've kind of been on, I guess, both sides of the table in your career. So curious to hear kind of your thoughts on that, and, when does it make sense to try and do something custom or in-house versus, going off the shelf?
Sure. Yeah. This is where I'm probably going to be kind of opinionated, so take it for what it is.
Sure,
but
go for it.
So early in my career, I built one.
Yeah.
And but along the lines, consulting, talking to a bunch of companies since then, I've never run into a situation where I would have advocated for building your own. I've talked to small and big companies that were coming from homegrown systems. And it typically all came down to technical debt and the cost to the business to maintain and keep those systems relevant. And then eventually they said, okay, well, people are retiring, we need to move, and it makes sense at this point to go to the off the shelf. And I think another catalyst there anyways is the fact that early on, like, there was the systems were much more expensive and cumbersome to take care of. If you go back 20, 30 years for this, that's where probably the dynamic was probably different. But more or less, I mean, we have the beauty of the cloud now, right? So we're not standing up servers. We're not doing things on premise. We don't need a whole bunch of people trying to maintain this internally, because you're really much more or less focusing on the business use cases when you have packaged software. Where I would say I deviate, where there's like that fine line, is about 80, maybe 90%, probably closer to 80%. These off-the-shelf systems will fit your needs. So really, it's that last 10 to 20% where I guess you call it your secret sauce, and that's where I would look at either complementary software where you can integrate, or building out some customizations to do what you do that's different than the rest of the industry. So that's what I've always advocated for. It's a light touch. I bumped into consulting firms that were competitors in the past, and that's where we typically butted heads. I was much more about embrace the software, and then look for where your processes are very unique, and then double down there, versus making the software do whatever you have in place at that point in time. It's technology, because down the road you're going to have to upgrade or replace it, and then you're going to still have those problems, and you have to do it again. So there's a balance there. In fact, I have a story. I'm not going to share names, but they came from homegrown. This was years ago, 14, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
They're very big, multi-billion-dollar company, came from homegrown. They bought a system, and instead of embracing it to an extent and taking some of the guidance, they chose to have the system behave like this old homegrown system. And they had it in place for a few years. It took forever to roll it out, right? Because you're doing lots of customization there. And then a few years later, when they had to upgrade, that's when they realized that, oh, we're never going to get off this treadmill. There's just so much uplift that has to happen ongoing. And it's like they came back and they're like, we should have taken your advice and really reevaluated how we did things, and then embrace the parts that aren't really critical to our business and do them the software way, whatever software we chose, and move forward. So, I mean, there's a lot of that. So that's the recap is, I just don't see the money in it. And then that was really at the end of my career, where the job that I was building the software, they were already changing their tune. They realized that they were spending way too much time just supporting the platform and not moving the business forward. And at that point, they could see the cost and say, you know what, it probably makes sense to look around and then just do the 10 to 20% on top of that instead.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that makes so much sense, because I think too, like, part of it is, are you I mean, are you like a software business, or are you, a business that's trying to deliver goods to somebody, right? And I think
Exactly.
if there's no real like competitive advantage or, proprietary thing that you're going to develop, like, why are you going to do that? Because, there's so many options like we talked about in this conversation out there now. There's got to be like something that can fit for you to be able to do that. And then, like you said, like what's the ongoing, maintenance of that? Like when you need to try and upgrade something, how much is that going to cost? Like what's your total cost of real ownership in that sense over the long term? I think it's a really big thing to take a look at. So yeah, very, very interesting here and insightful with you, Casey. And I'm curious, let's wrap it up with your one top tip for somebody looking to get their first WMS.
I'm going to merge two that I had here. I think this would probably
Okay.
make a lot of sense. Really, is no matter where you are at, there's tribal knowledge in your business. So focusing on capturing that, and I advocate for visual process flows because they're easily relatable to everybody. Leadership down to people that are on the floors working there. They can look at that and quickly grasp what's going on. But taking the time to map all that out before you talk to vendors will give you so much more mileage. Vendors can give you better advice and advocate for certain solutions. You can weigh them against, different vendors against each other based on how they would approach something, because you have the meat that most customers don't really have. In my experience, if they have any process flows at all, they're usually old and outdated. They're inconsistently put together. And then you do a lot of this work during design after you buy. And that's where the costs weren't necessarily baked in. There was assumptions around that being done already. So that's one of the first places that people get derailed. So that's my top tip right there.
All right. And great tip. I love that. I'm a process guy myself, and I love a good visual process flow or good SOP, a process doc. So very great tip there and great information overall in this conversation here today, Casey. So I appreciate you coming on and joining me and letting the listeners in on all this WMS knowledge. So if people are interested in getting in touch with you or learning more about Fullstride, what's the best way to do that?
I spend a bunch of time on LinkedIn. I'm there. I'm sharing my thoughts multiple times a week. I'm interacting with others. I'm doing more of these podcasts, which I'll share on my feed as well. So I mean, there's plenty of ways to stay engaged that way and reach out messages, but just kind of pick my brain or go from there. One thing I wanted to call out is like more of an announcement is right now we do something called Clarity First. We were talking about that, and it's a 12-week program. And a lot of the feedback I've gotten through prospects talking over this first half a year is it takes too long and it's too expensive. So one thing we've done, and we're going through it now, we're piloting it with the first few customers, is trying to break that down into Clarity in a week effectively, or less than 2 weeks. And to make that much more approachable, right? The cost is more accessible to smaller businesses, so I can impact more people, which is part of my mission. I want to help as many businesses as possible. So make that easier to do, but also give you answers, action plans very quickly, right? That you can take and run with yourself versus the done with you model that I had done before. So trying to open that up to more and more people. And we haven't released that on our website yet, but we're going through that. And if that's something that people are curious about, hopefully by the time this airs, I'll have it fully baked on my website and be talking about it in more detail. But that's what's going on with us.
All right, fantastic. And sounds like a great program there as well. And we'll certainly put all that information so you can easily connect with Casey, follow along with him on LinkedIn, and check out the Fullstride website as well at thenewwarehouse.com so people can easily find it. So, Casey, thank you once again for your time on the show today.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Enjoyed this episode? Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast, and for more content from the New Warehouse, find us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Links to subscribe can be found in the show notes. And for everything The New Warehouse, head to thenewwarehouse.com.